Well, today's been a great day for me because I realize that some presidents do actually speak French. I want to thank Professor Dominic Kobi for having invited me to address this select audience on this historical development of SNOMED, because for some time now I have sort of been staying in Sherbrooke and working on just the French, and I didn't get out too much, and now I found it quite a challenge. I didn't know you were so far away from Sherbrooke, but anyhow, finally made it here with the help of my wife. So anyhow, I wanted to present to you what I have been working on, not just the nomenclature for the last so many years, but for the last 3 years I have been putting together all the paperwork from my files, and I've actually written the history, which is about 250 pages now of text. So I summarized some of that to give you a flavor of what it takes and how you develop such a nomenclature, because before SNOMED or SNOP even, there was no nomenclature. We had classifications, you know, a list of things in which, like baskets in which you put things in, but there was no such thing as a medical nomenclature. And this had not been recognized, not even by the WHO, because they figured that with the ICD, that is the International Classification of Disease, you could do everything. And you could before the age of the computer. But after that, it was from one disaster to another. Anyhow, this new approach of multi-axial coding began with the publication of SNOP. And SNOP took about 10 years to come to fruition. In other words, from 1955, the Board of Governors of the College of American Pathologists put together a committee to look at the situation in pathology, and the objective was to develop a working nomenclature for pathologic diagnoses. After this period of time, finally published SNOP. That was 1965. Hope this is the right button. Right. So that is the SNOP from 1965. At that time, also, people were looking at the coding of diagnoses, starting in pathology. And this actually took a group of people at the NIH, the National Cancer Center, Dr. Pratt and his group, and they developed a coding system for most of the pathology diagnoses using a field edition of SNOP, and finally publishing the results in 1966, 1 year after the book came out. But they had a head start with a field trial edition. So this is what they had to say about all this. The continuing experimental evaluation indicates that the nomenclature as recently published, that is the first edition of SNOP, is complete enough to provide for automatic storage and retrieval of most pathology data. Now that's a long time ago, 66. In addition, preliminary experiments have shown that the new nomenclature is applicable for the coding of clinical manifestations of disease, because there was an axis there called the F-axis, which had a lot of signs and symptoms, things that pathologists really never used, but they were. So that this actually was a starting point with Pratt and at NIH and others to actually get involved in developing a nomenclature for medicine. Now, when I came to Sherbrooke in 1969 on a 5-year contract, and I'm still there, we got some people together to do a French edition of SNOP and to repeat with the French language what had been done by Pratt at the NIH. Now, you have Bruce Barkman, he's a linguist. Sister Gabrielle Tanguy, by the way, she's still with us. She's a Grey nun who is a nurse, medical record librarian, and so forth. She began the first school in Quebec of medical record librarians. Myself and another medical record librarian, and the fellow there was sort of Dr. Lavallée was the head of research. He got into all the pictures, never did anything. But you know, that's what vice deans do, isn't it? And Dr. Kuzner was a hematologist, and he did quite a bit in the translation of SNOP. So this new philosophy of multi-axial coding for pathology really took off in all directions. And an example of this is that already by 1974, there was a Japanese edition of SNOP. And we had our own French edition, and there was an edition for the Dutch people by Palga, which is an organization in Holland, and a Spanish and Portuguese of South America. So SNOP itself as a mini nomenclature, or as a nomenclature organized for one specialty, which was anatomic pathology, was already in wide use before we ever came out with a SNOMED. Because it was the thing to do, it was the way to go, and it was entity coding, and it was no longer coding with classifications. The most interesting thing is these funny people here. The Canadian Association of Medical Record Librarians. Now, you wouldn't call one of those people a librarian anymore. They're medical record administrators. But back then, this association recognized what SNOP could do, and they held conferences all over. They mandated the teaching of the SNOP, SNOMED philosophy in all their schools. And the first meeting in Banff was with the people at the NIH, and we had people like Pratt. We had exercises, English-speaking delegates there. That was Kathy Holmes. Some people probably know who she is, and Sister Tanguy. And we had coding sessions in both French and English, courtesy of UNIVAC. So this was this meeting, and that's back in '72. So as you can see, we've come a long way, but everyone at that time was sort of hooked on the idea that we needed to name the things before we could classify them. So okay, that's at the end of that meeting, I was asked to write an article for the medical record librarians or administrators, and I think the important thing about that was that they wanted me to push them to get involved more and more, so that I threw out a challenge. And the challenge was to them, to the medical record administrators, well, as soon as governments who paid the bill realize that medical information, to be useful in every sense, has to be captured and coded at the source, there will be demand for competent people to do that. And who are the people better prepared to handle medical information, to interpret it, code it, if not the medical record librarian, now medical record administrator. And you know, that stayed there from 1972 until short time after, because here the association, under the influence of its education committee, what I call the avant-garde committee with Sister Tanguy, was pushing all the schools to teach this basic philosophy of multi-axial coding, besides having to learn the ICD. So anyhow, let's see, where do we go on this one? There. Now, sometime after 1972, that is during all the 70s, we were involved with many groups, and mostly in Europe. And it was of historical importance for the first slide that when we bought a system from Health Data Sciences in 1989, a medical record librarian was put in charge of the data, because they're the ones that know how to handle the data, keep it confidential, and so forth. So the guardian of the data in our system, our HDS system, is a medical record person. So what I said in '72 finally came true in '89. Now in 1973, because that was '72, the '89 is just a, prove that I was right. There must be a way to do that. I was appointed chairman of the Committee on Nomenclature and Classification of Disease by the College of American Pathology in 1973. They said, there's a guy up in Canada, he's crazy enough to do this, we'll give him the job. So I took on the job of developing a SNOMED. And for that, I had to meet with different people at different times and in different places. And this particular group of funny people it's important to know that Edmund Van Brunt was at Kaiser Permanente. Tom Lincoln is from the Rand Corporation. Arnold Pratt is from the NIH. But the interesting thing about Van Brunt and Tom Lincoln and why we met in Toulouse, France, is they both have French wives. So, you know, that's even better than a French girlfriend, because you have to stop paying her. So a series of conferences were being held in Europe, because the real inventors of the mot informatique médicale and so forth is Professor François Grémy of France. He founded the discipline, which dates back to about 1967, when he was president of a committee, a technical committee for information processing in the International Federation for Information Processing. And François Grémy is the one that developed that and became the first president of AMIA, the International Medical Informatics Association. So the French term informatique translates as information processing and is accepted in most languages. But it was only in 1990 that the Americans found out what it meant. And in the US, they actually put together an association they call AMIA, the American Medical Informatics Association. So that now every association, probably I think Coach hasn't changed yet. Huh? Coach is still a horse and buggy situation. No? Yeah. Dominic, Coach means what?
Canadian Organization for the Advancement of Computers in Health.
Oh, that's nice. Anyhow, so these early Toulouse meetings is what gave us a lot of contacts and food for thought with all the French people that we met there, and others, because eventually the English went there. The English are much better in French than the Americans. And we finally decided to develop the basic philosophy for the different axes that we have in SNOMED. So this is where we go to the axes. I found all the old slides. Now, this was in a paper prepared for Dr. Elmer Gabrielli's Journal of Clinical Computing, September 1973. See, I keep all these things so that somebody says you made that up, I have the proof. Anyhow, so I got those out of the journal, and I had the original colored ones. They're not very good, but they actually show you why we have different axes in SNOMED. You see, you have a normal structure, the hand and the head, and normal function. If you're sick, you have something abnormal in your structure, which we call morphology, and something abnormal in your function. That's the pathophysiology. Okay, so that happens to you. Now, for this to happen to you, there must be some cause, either outside the body, inside the body, or unknown. So there is something that acts on you for your state to go from a normal state to a sick state. That's the basic philosophy. Then, how do you take care of that? What is the role of medicine in reversing these processes to bring you back from the sick state to the healthy state? Is that we use procedures. And procedures will act either on the etiologic agent, for example, give you an antibiotic for Staphylococcus aureus, or it will act on your structure, for example, repair a fracture of the femur. So the team acts on different parts, either the anatomy or the function. If you have diarrhea, they give you one of these pills or something. I don't know, but there are ways of acting on the body by the healthcare team. And the healthcare team that acts on the body like that, we call that procedure, because it is those procedures that the healthcare team is being paid for. So the CPTs and those Canadian classification of procedures, all those things are made to pay the people who do the work. While all the rest goes on in the head of the physician or the nurse or the healthcare worker, the cogitation that goes on there to arrive at a diagnosis, that is not paid for directly. It's what you do about it. So with all this in hand, and with further enhancements, we started developing the different axes. Now, based on these fundamental categories, we put out a SNOMED field trial, and in 1975 sent out 450 evaluation packages to different sites. And where you see all those pennies, they're not those pennies, but those pins with little colored heads, those are all people that participated. And if you get a close-up of Canada and the U.S., I had to put the cap thing there because the college insisted. But their editors, committees, consultants, field trial, and all those people there, actually, there are more in the U.S. than anywhere else, but all those people participated in all those field trials. So we actually had quite a bit of information and things to do with those field trials. And the field trial on the first SNOMED, on the first fascicles we sent out was a separate fascicle for topography, morphology, function, etiology, disease, and procedure. The disease was a list very close to an ICD, so we would have an entry point to go to the ICDs and point to come out. Now, in 1975, our university being a little bit like here, we have all these people who spend their time making fun of others. And L'Actualité Médicale said, SNOMED, what is it? And they took the terminology as used by Dr. Simon, the radiologist. And in English, Dr. Simon says, well, we have trouble diagnosing things because not only are we dealing with shadows, but we're dealing with all kinds of terms. And he had a series called A Spherical Shadow, probably due to a primary malignancy of the lung, an ovoid mass, probably representing a lung cancer, a rounded nodule suggestive of pulmonary carcinoma. And this chap put that there, and he made the sketch of a machine going bananas trying to digest the food. Okay, so the comment by Simon is one that stayed in my head. He said, the freedom of poetry is the despair of science. In other words, if you're going to use all these poetic terms, how are you going to get science out of it? So. Now, after that, in 76, 77, we published SNOMED 1, and that was a series of fascicles. It was an enhanced version of the field trial. And many groups used these, just the morphology, but there were 6 of those. Matter of fact, the chap who did the topography, that is the anatomy model, not only handed us a beautifully done English, but he had done from the Nomina Anatomica a complete Latin topography, which pleases Scandinavian countries because a lot of the people up there still use the Latin. I guess some of the Hungarians use the Latin topography in dermatology. Anyhow, so we had an anatomy that was in Latin and in English. That should have sufficed. See, now, the second edition in 1979 was published as a 2-volume edition. And we had numerous editions. Now, this is where we added the occupation list. Because what I showed you before about the body and all that and the function and the procedures, well, a person with all this works somewhere. And later on we said, yes, but he also lives somewhere. So we have a social context access as well as an access for the type of work he does. Now, in April of 1981, there was a Dr. David Shires who worked in Halifax, and he was president of AMIA. And he wrote to me regarding a proposal for the establishment of a new AMIA working group, a working group on medical nomenclature and coding. So I wrote a proposal which Dr. Shires presented to the AMIA General Assembly in Rome in September, and following this meeting, Shires wrote back to me confirming my appointment as chairman of this new working group. So, It always helps to write something up. So this was Working Group 6, Role of Informatics in the Classification and Coding of Health Data. Now, in the mandate, there were 3 objectives. Review health data nomenclature and classification needs for the world community. Evaluate information processing technology in meeting these defined needs, and to recommend methods for future classifications and nomenclature systems. So the first meeting was organized in Ottawa with the help of people from StatsCan, John Davis in particular, and the collaboration of this organization called COACH, which was the official national representative of AMIA in Canada. I think it still is, huh? No? Now, of all the supporting organizations, the major ones were Health and Welfare Canada and Statistics Canada. The Canadian Government Conference Centre, which is a nice centre in Ottawa, was provided to us free of charge. Tax money. 50 experts from 15 countries were invited to discuss the basic issues of nomenclatures and classifications in the world of healthcare. So following 2.5 days of deliberation, you know, there were some recommendations, and some are probably worth citing. And I think this probably says it all. In future healthcare information systems, the user interface should be based upon natural language. The generation of numerical or alphanumeric codes should occur within the computer, so the doctor doesn't see the codes. Automatic encoding of natural language should be used, and morbidity and mortality statistical classification requirements of national and international group should be the byproduct of medically based healthcare information. In other words, you should have your healthcare information, and as a byproduct of this, you devise what is needed to create your statistics or to pay the people. And that's the pyramid, which I'll show later how. Now, the proceedings were published. See, you recognize Dennis Prati, Scherer from Geneva. He died some time ago. And R.A. Côté, and I'm still alive, more or less. Okay, now. Now, there was a second WG6 conference in 1988, in September 1988. By that time, the chap doing all of the language work and the mathematics, Vingard, had died of a heart attack, and he wasn't at this conference, so that most of his work was presented by myself or one of my colleagues. But he had done a lot of interesting work in coding, either directly to the nomenclature or directly to the ICDs. Now, this is an extract of this second working conference. Now, there is a strong relationship between standardization and representation. It is not possible to represent anything without some form of standardization. And SNOMED is an attempt to represent medical knowledge in a functional, standardized form. To get the full knowledge, the relationships between things should be known. If one can detect new relationships, it enhances the present knowledge, in contrast to expert systems. The multidimensional SNOMED special representation is more powerful than a one-dimensional taxonomic approach, like the ICD. So SNOMED is a critical structure for auto-indexing and coding. So this was already back in '88, and things in Europe were beginning to boil up over SNOMED for some reason, while things were still cool in Canada. We had a north wind, getting wind from the north. Now, this is the proceedings of that particular conference. Now, S.H. Mandel, he was in biomedical communication at WHO, very interested in what we were doing, but the people from the ICD unit did not want to get involved. Now, following the meeting, in between the two meetings of the WG6, there was a meeting in Helsinki in '85, And there was a roundtable discussion on nomenclature and classification. Myself, Rothwell, André Lours, and Francis Roger France, Scherer, Peterson, and Wingert. And here again, there were some important, there was an important message sent out to the Europeans, because this was MIE, was Medical Informatics Europe. Now, the three most important recommendations was that a uniform nomenclature with definitions and equivalences be developed for each language and country. That a coded meta-language such as SNOMED act as a bridge between the different languages. And that automatic computer encoding of natural medical language be developed in each country as a means of capturing the physician's data. So that was in between those other two meetings. Now, during the 1980s, there was a growing interest in SNOMED by the veterinary community. I think there's a veterinary college around here somewhere. Guelph? Okay, because I think we had some dealings with that at one time. There was a Dr. James Palatay, a veterinary pathologist from the Oregon Primate Center, who had this comment for the SNOMED committee. He says, to us vets, you humans are just another species. So in other words, you know, a medical nomenclature should encompass everything, because, you know, what happens in one species could just as well happen to you, another species. So in 1984, based on the 1979 SNOMED 2, they had published a subset called SNOVET for small animals. And then they continued with us and furnished most of the information we have in SNOMED International. So they were interested in working on this. In 1987, a proposal was made to the Board of Governors of CAP to develop a third edition, which we wanted to call SNOMED International, the Systematized Nomenclature of Human and Veterinary Medicine. And this proposal was finally approved on the basis of the growing national and international interest in a multi-axial coding system. Because up to that time, there was no such animal. So from 1987 to 1993, date of publication of SNOMED, there were numerous activities that kept us all hopping. This, of course, was over above the around-the-clock work on SNOMED, because in 1989 I obtained a large grant for a research project, which was actually to buy a medical information system for the hospital, but we sold it on the basis that the hospital was our laboratory, and we needed to have all this information to check the language and the coding and so forth. And anyhow, so we got this big system, and from that particular time on, I was liberated from all those autopsies and all that dirty work. So I became just full-time on the project. Now, in 1988, I was invited to a Scandinavian seminar on knowledge-based systems in medicine. It was in Tampere, Finland. And that's where I met Dr. Andrew Grant, that some of you know, who's now working on evaluation methodology in Canada. In 1989, I gave the first European presentation on SNOMED International within the 900th anniversary celebration of the University of Bologna. That's a little bit older than Waterloo. As a matter of fact, it was founded just a little bit after the Battle of Hastings. That's for the Anglo-Saxons here. But the year was what? 1066. And he's not even an Anglo-Saxon, and he got it. So anyhow, that university was really old, and they had this 900th anniversary with all kinds of special things, and the pathologist had something special, and I gave a presentation there. But it wasn't until 1982 that academia said, hey, this SNOMED is going somewhere. Let's do something. And here they did something. You know, those recognize that funny people with the hat? That's the University of Victoria. Okay. Now, in October 1992, the biochemists got interested in SNOMED. They said, well, what's all this about? How can you explain to us what SNOMED is? What is a nomenclature different than a classification? So somehow someone hit me on the head with some lead. And I said, let's take 4 lead compounds and see what, from the big Merck index. So that lead monoxide is also called lead oxide, yellow, plumbous oxide, lead protoxide, and the formula is PbO. Now, when they create lead compounds, the biochemists will take the elements from the table of elements. So in SNOMED, we have a table of 11 axes of elements or basic concepts which we can put together to create a disease or to create a diagnosis. So with this explanation, it was easy enough to sell them on the idea. Anybody disagree with that? I'm not a chemist, I wouldn't know. Okay, now the difference between the classification and a nomenclature, if you take acute appendicitis and you break that down into its components, like you would for, the lead oxide, you say there's an appendix, and the acute appendicitis means acute inflammation of the appendix. So you have acute inflammation. You have 2 elements that make up a diagnosis. And staphylococcal pneumonia, well, it's the lung. There is inflammation, that's what the pneumonia means, and it's due to staphylococcus. And I didn't break it down further than staphylococcus as a genus, because there are many, many species. The most important one would be Staphylococcus aureus. The Staphylococcus dory, the golden staphylococcus. Anyhow, so we can go to the bugs galore. Okay, so this is the 1993 publication of SNOMED, and this is some of the information that went out. And of course, there were a lot of comments at that time when people looked at what SNOMED was all about. And this is one from Science. Some reporter from Science looked at this, and he said, a national medical record database is essential, and one framework has emerged as a clear leader, the Systematized Nomenclature of Human Veterinary Medicine. That came from Science in November 1993, and the books were published in July 93. Now, let's see now. Slide 30. Okay. Yeah, that's the SNOMED, the 4 volumes and the different formats in which it came. I see a magnetic tape there. Nobody uses that anymore. Now, these are the axes that we have for SNOMED 3, and topography, this was the basic SNOMED 3. Now, this has been enhanced quite a bit. There are many more items in all of these. But topography had 13,000 terms for anatomic sites or organs or structures. Morphology, 6,000. But if you take the 13,000 and multiply that by the 6,000, you keep building on this, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Functions, 19. Living organisms, 25,000. That's up more to like 30,000 now. Chemicals and drugs. Physical agents, occupation, social context, disease and diagnosis. Well, that is the part that takes the things that are put together and are called something, that disease diagnosis, and they're classified there with an equivalency in the ICD, so you have a bridge to go to the ICD classifications. And then there's procedures, and the procedures are just with 31,000 procedures, but there are many more than that in the, that are available, except that most countries will want to use SNOMED, but with their own procedure code. Like in Canada, there's a procedure code. Because this is what the governments use to build their DRGs, to build the doctors. No, for the doctors to build them. So to monitor all this, they have their own. So that the P-axis, seen as multi-axial, can be unplugged, and you can plug in whatever procedure axis you want. Now, this is an explanation of how the things work. You have the topography, morphology, living organisms, and here there are two. And now you have the Borrelia burgdorferi, but then you have the tick, which is the scapularis. And this equates Lyme carditis. Now, there is no such thing as Lyme carditis in the ICD, but they did put into ICD-10 Lyme disease. So everything that's Lyme, whether it's the carditis, whether it's the skin reaction, whether it's the arthritis, and all, that all goes into one. Okay? But in ICD-9, just before, there was no room for any of these Borrelias. But Borrelia being one of the spirochetes, there was a basket called 104.8, other infections due to spirochetes. So imagine how much stuff went in there and got lost. You could never go to that number and get it out. But it was a place to put it so that you could charge so much for whatever you did, and it was counted as one of those. But this 0.8 was such a problem that in the U.S. the medical record people examined everything that had been done in the United States, and they checked to see what was the most frequent diagnosis according to the ICD codes in the U.S., and they came out with other and ill-defined disease. That was the code most frequently used. So, you know, did we need something better? Yes. Is SNOMED the answer? We're not sure, but it's a good step on the way. Okay, let's see. What do you have here? The pyramid. Yeah. That's Marion Ball, who wrote the preface to the books, and he had a lot of nice things to say about it. But now the Composite Clinical Data Dictionary, C squared, D squared. Now, just recently I heard someone come to Canada from the U.S. as the Messiah and talk to the people at McGill about creating a C squared, D squared as though it had been just recently invented. Marion Ball said that in '93. He came in 2003, 10 years later, a consultant, highly paid consultant, talking about C squared, D squared. When people called me and asked me about that, I said, oh, I'm not a salesman. Sorry about that. but, you know, some people will sell anything, you know. So she is the one that pushed the idea of being able to code a complete summary and transfer that summary to another country. They decode it, like here, decode an English summary in Japan, and you have it in Japanese. Or in Chinese. Chinese are more advanced right now. Now this here is my famous pyramid. You look at that, and before you used to have pyramids the other way around, where the point of the pyramid was down, and that was the computer system to pay the people and to order things, supplies, and it was a financial system. And then on top of that, you tried to put all this heavyweight material of medical information, and it just didn't do. You have to do it the other way around. You take the medical information, here I put the healthcare reference terminology, but SNOMED CT because it's the latest, but the regular SNOMED belongs there too. And you start by naming the things, and then you decide how you classify them, and once they're classified, you can count them, and then you can pay from the DRGs. Now this is the logical way of doing it. But the people that had the most clout in hospitals were the financial people, so they put in financial systems, thinking that they would save money. They sure didn't. Okay, here's a good one for some of you. What happened after all that? Well, sometime in 1996, I was invited to give a presentation, and this was a trilingual presentation with automatic encoding in Italian, French, and English in Bologna to a bunch of people there. And Mr. Fernand Tanguy was the ambassador to the Vatican at that time, and he knew how to go about getting something approved for the Vatican Library. He said, first of all, it has to be original and this and that, and the paperwork to fill out. And he just sent in an application to see if SNOMED, as a 4-volume edition of the first medical nomenclature, was something that could go into the Vatican Library. So here I am at the Vatican Library. It got accepted. We presented that on one of these strips. And that was Cardinal Poggi. We gave him a special leather-bound edition of SNOMED. And they do have some clinics associated with the Vatican. But I think this wasn't really the most important thing. I think this was. Because you know what he's saying to me? You're from Canada? Do you know Dominic Kobi? I said, no. Who is he? He says, he's actually part Polish. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Somebody's got to get back at Dominic once in a while. Okay, I put a blank after that because that was too much to leave it on. Let's see now. Okay, well, I think after that we could go all the way to 1997 because 1997 was a turning point in the SNOMED development. That's the year that represents the end of the SNOMED era, dominated by pathologists and all the fun we had. Now we had all these computer people, non-pathologists, MBAs, SOBs, and all these people with different sort of diplomas trying to get in on and to tell the college and the pathologists what to do with this and how to organize it. So the college decided to, after 3.5, because what you saw, the books was 3.0, that's the books. And then we did other, but not in print form, they were on CD. And what they wanted to do now is do something with it, because they said, Roger, you created a monster, we're stuck with it, what do we do with it? So they put together the usual committee, you know, and they finally decided that they had had enough of me and that they would put some real computer people in charge to do something with this, you know, because I said, well, it's their user. So the last editorial board meeting that I chaired, it was in '97 at Kennebunkport with 2 lobsters and the committee. And all knew at that time that there was a change in the wind, change coming because of all the things that were going on. So the CAP had created a large committee and decided that they would have a board and another board to oversee the board and an authority over the board that would report directly to the Board of Governors of the CAP. They created a monstrous thing. Then they got together with the British and created another monster. Anyhow, I think that some of this transcends in some of the handouts there, where finally the college came out with a press release. I think you have that in one of the handouts. And I think that press release probably says it all. You know, they said, well, we got this, we got that, now we're going to do this and that. And so since that time, it's been in the hands of the college. And the people who are running that now, I think they have good intentions. But I'm too busy with the French to have anything to do with that. I think at the last meeting, though, what they finally said, and reminded me of what Octo Barnett told me, that I was embarking 10 years ago on something impossible. You can't do that. The doctors can't talk the same language. What's this? Not even in English. You know, so they gave us a cake, Louise, Dave, and myself. Dave wasn't there. He had a falling out with the college at the last minute and decided not to come. So there was 2 of us from Sherbrooke, with all these Americans from CDC, National Library, all these bigwigs. There were 2 little people from Sherbrooke, and we had done an impossible job. Now that it had become possible, they took it over. and they hired 17 people to be able to run the show that we were doing with 2. C'est la vie, hein? So anyhow, that wasn't the end of it, though, but here. There was a yearbook of medical informatics in '99. There were some selected impact papers. Those on the electronic patient record, and there was a paper that they selected from 1977 that they considered a seminal paper, something, so. Let's see now. Now the commentary written by Roger France from Belgium about SNOP SNOMED, he said, the article on SNOP SNOMED by Article is a milestone on the road towards the electronic health record. because it moves away from traditional monoaxial classification systems, such as the International Classification of Disease, to the field of the structuring of concepts. And I think maybe that's probably the best thing we can say about it. We're finally away from this monoaxial ICD, WHO, you know, because WHO was never a place to go to get things done. Matter of fact, in many meetings, it was considered the most constipated organization of health people in the world, you know? And it just doesn't move. Okay, now, after all this, what has happened is that in 1999, there was a meeting in Washington, and we found out that the CAP and the UK were going to go together and make the read codes disappear, because breed had already disappeared with 57 million pounds, so that they made the read codes disappear into what is called now the National Health Service clinical terms, and they were going to do this thing. So the CAP was working with the US on that. Then came along the new agreement, which is this one, and it's in July 1, 2003. The US Secretary of State said that, well, we'll sign a contract with CAP, and all Americans and all American companies who have at least a business there, starting in January 1 in 2004, will be able to use SNOMED free of charge. They have to get a license, but there's no fee. The license is just to keep track of who's doing what. So that if Sierra decides to sell a system in the States and they don't have a license, well, you know. So, now these people, probably all of you know them, Betsy Humphrey, Donald Lindbergh, Paul Raslavicus, there's that Lithuanian. Ken Spackman, well, he's an ex-Canadian also, he's from Alberta. And I think this about does it. Here you have the signature. So Paul Raslavicus and Donald Lindbergh are signing the papers to create this monster. If we have 2 minutes, I just want to show you the names of the people that were involved all along the line. We had people in Denmark who did a Danish edition, Portuguese, Brazil, a complete Brazil, Portuguese edition there. Chinese is done. I have it home on a CD, but I can't read it. Well, I don't know whether it's Mandarin or something else. Probably not. And Turkish is just pathology. Swedish is mostly pathology. Russian, let's see, that was done in St. Petersburg. Those were done by pathologists. The Japanese SNOMED, and Spanish, Italian, Hungarian, Czech, German, and French is last, and it's not done. And I'm not proud of that, but I'm working on it. So I think now what we can say is you have sort of a brushed nylon sort of a look at the development of SNOMED, and I think now the thing is, where do I go from there, or where do we go from there? And I think the quo vadis of the whole thing is that we have to finish the French. We have to align it with the English that we can use in Canada and have a bilingual edition for Canada. But only about 2 months ago did the Quebec Health Ministry realize that, and that they're now going to pay for some of the development. Qu'est-ce que tu penses de ça? Better close that machine there. No?
Thank you, Roger.
Okay.